Panzerschule uses and recommends golden maple brushes. Our painting guides will now show you which golden maple brush type, which brush size we are using for all the different challenges that we meet in our modelling projects. Golden maple have been making artist brushes for over 30 years. Panzerschule can confidently recommend golden maple brushes to you because of the value, the quality and the range of brushes they have in their miniature painting sets. You can see us using the golden maple brushes in the following guide, and if you'd like to know more then check the link in the description below. There is also a discount code in the description, and if you use that code when ordering, not only will you save a bit of money but you'll also help the channel. Now let's get painting. I began by the very simple assembly that was required for this piece. The cruciform and the base itself are just one piece resin. The gun is from the plastic sprue and you're only using the mount and the gun itself here. I gave the ground a coat of London grey. Any kind of light grey will do because that's just going to be an undercoat, like a base colour for the snow that I'll be painting there. And then the gun itself, I just brush painted on Tamiya Dark Yellow 2. I would normally airbrush Tamiya paint, but in this case with just one small gun on one small piece, I really didn't want to fire up the airbrush, go through the whole process of preparing it and cleaning it and everything, so I just brushed it on by hand. Now when you're doing anything like that at all, in any kind of subject where you're going to be painting large areas, you've got to be patient. It's going to take more than 2 coats. 2 coats will do the bulk of it, and then another coat at least to finish it. With Tamiya you have to be extra careful because when you are brushing it on, it takes a long time to dry. It is a lacquer paint, not an acrylic paint as such, so it will lift off as you apply wet paint on top of it, because the lacquer element just lifts it off, so you have to make sure each coat is completely dry before you apply the next. Now I am applying the pin wash. I didn't apply a coat of varnish here. I normally would, once again, but by airbrush, and I didn't want to brush on a coat of varnish. A brushed on coat of varnish can usually be very patchy or just far too heavy. So here I'm just carefully applying it across the surface, and you can see how I'm just working each area individually. I'm using a MIG Ammo acrylic wash here, not an enamel wash. I find it's better than the enamel wash, but that's just a matter of personal opinion perhaps. But you can see how easily controlled I've got this over an unvarnished surface with this acrylic wash. As I often say, pin washing requires a lot of patience, but you can see how sharp a result you can get, how bright the surrounding areas of the subject are. I'm not darkening the whole thing, I'm just laying the foundations for some nice good contrasting shade, and next some highlights. I'm starting the highlighting process using an old beat up brush that has still got a decent edge to it. By that I mean I can use the flat of the brush to bounce it along the surface of the exposed edges, or let's call them the external edges. I'm using the old brush here because if you're bouncing your brush along edges, hitting it against all these sharp corners all the time, it quite often wears it out a lot quicker than normal painting would do, so I use the old brush to save my new brushes. I'm going to be using the Golden Maple size 0 round brush. That's the more conical bristles. Now this brush is going to be good for me to do all of the internal highlighting and all the fine detailing. The conical shape of the brush gives it a little bit more resistance, and this is ideal for highlighting all of the little point details, all of the small areas such as bolts and nuts, rivets, the dials on the mechanism of the gun and such likes. Paint flow is very important here. The brush needs to be able to release the right amount of paint, which means not only does it have to have a good point on it and have good moisture retention, you've also got to have your paint mixed correctly. That way you will get the paint down in one pass, and this is what we want when we're painting small highlights and small scratches. If the paint is too wet, it will go down in a semi-opaque line and it will also spread across the surface, and you don't want that. You want fine control. If the paint is too dry, it will drag across the surface and then it will go on quite lumpy and you'll get a ragged looking line. As part of the highlighting process, I also apply the first layer of chipping. Now, a lot of chipping is just surface wear, so that's why the edges, which we're highlighting, are a good starting point for the chipping. So keeping things in scale, folks, remember we don't want to make something look like it should be in a scrapyard. We're going to use the same highlight colour, which is Iraqi sand, and we're going to apply just little chips, map out chipping which is just slightly lighter colour, slightly lighter than the base colour, which represents these shallow chips. Next I'm going to use golden maple size 30, which has got that same conical shape again for the point work that we're doing here. This brush has a fine point, and that's what we need here, because we need to paint inside all of those little scratches and chips that we have painted on during the highlighting process. The German Camo Black Brown is a dark colour and it stands out very strongly against the lighter dark yellow here, so once again keep things in scale. If you do too much here, it's going to look really wrecked, and we don't want the gun looking wrecked, unless of course that's the scene you're trying to recreate. Chipping as part of the weathering process can be a lot of fun. It can be easy to take it too far, so consider your base colours, your chipping colours, and the dark core chipping colour that you're going to use. Keep things in balance and you'll get a nice finished look. At this point I felt that the barrel itself just lacked a little bit of depth, a little bit of three-dimensionality almost, because it was just brush painted. So using an old brush, once again I'm just taking my shade colour, the same shade mix that I used for the pin wash, and I'm just carefully shading the underside just off the end section of the barrel, just to give it a little bit more shape and definition and contrast. And that will be the 88 done, so now we can move on to the figures. So to paint the crew I'm going to be using the golden maple size 30 brush. You can see it's a longer, thinner set of bristles compared to what we used before. The more flexible bristles that you get on this style of brush will allow you to flow around the contours of the miniature. And having that fluid motion is important for the layering approach that I use. You can see here that this figure that's going to be in a white camo smock has been given an overall coat of London Grey. I'm then going to use deck tan to start mapping out and building up the raised areas, with the idea of leaving some of that London Grey as a shade colour to help define the shape. You'll note it's deck tan that I'm using here and not a white or off-white colour. Using something like deck tan, which is a greyish white, will give us a very white finish without the struggles that are associated with painting white. You know, the pigment in so many white paints is just really awkward to use. You know, it tends to be, I would describe it as almost clotted when you're trying to put it on. Deck tan though will give us a white look without actually painting white. In every circumstance when you're painting the large areas of the miniature, such as a uniform, it's going to take two coats to get the correct coverage. This is especially important when you're doing something with white, or in this case deck tan. So when you first pass, do what I call the mapping, where you're picking out all of the raised areas and leaving the shaded areas. And then in your second coat you can refine that by not only giving a more opaque layer of paint on top as a second coat, but cutting into the shading. You do not want to leave too much shading. If there's too much shading, the figure's going to look too stark, too stripy. The shading is there as an accent to the main colour, not a dominant colour. And when layering really light colours such as this, you can also, once you've got the main coats down, before you do the highlighting, apply a glaze of that main colour. In this case it would be deck tan. Now remember, a glaze is not a wash. You don't want it settling into the recessed areas. You just want it to be a semi-opaque layer over the entire surface. That will soften the transition between dark to light, which is quite useful in these very high contrast situations. But don't overdo it, because if things get too soft, then we're going to lose the high contrast that we're after between the shade and the final highlight, and we're going to move on to the final highlight next. Now you may find it makes putting the second coat of paint on, the critical coat that was said will define the finished look, using a smaller brush. Here I'm using a size 50, once again long thin bristles for the flow and action that we need, just to finish off the shape, the final shape, and get that second layer down. Now before the final highlight, I'm going to paint the helmet just white. Just going to use the highlight colour. Going to use an old brush, because painting helmets, once again, that's just graft, folks. You don't want to use your fine pointed brushes on this. And take a couple of coats to get this down, but if it looks a bit messy after just one coat, you might want to leave it like that, because we're going to weather it down anyway. So for highlight, I'm going to be using the 10-0 brush, a very small fine brush that will give us all of the control that we need for this critical stage. You'll note these highlight lines are very, very thin, and I'm using just white for this, folks. It stands out strongly against the deck tan. It really gives us that white finish. But if you put on too much, then it becomes less of an accent, less of a highlight, and then becomes more like the main colour itself. So it's very important you keep the lines thin and flowing. And for this layering approach, to get the greatest degree of contrast, which is really important on a very small miniature, especially on the tabletop, it will really help give it the shape to pop, then you're going to need to put the highlight as much as possible beside the shade. So you'll have a very small shade line, a very small highlight line, and together that contrast will define the shape nice and clearly for everyone to see. Now it's back to the golden maple size 30 for our American para. Is it Spears? Is it Winters? I'm not sure. You guys can confirm that though in the comments. Now the shade coat here is German Camo Black Brown. It's a nice deep shade colour that will give us the contrast we need where we have green uniforms, brown uniforms and such likes, but it's not too stark. It's not like black. I'm using US dark green here, and once again I am going to be mapping out the shape in the first pass, picking out all the raised areas, leaving the shade, and then going back in with a second pass to really define the shape. This is one of those situations where I would not recommend a glaze as I did with the lighter colours, because we will lose the contrast, and we really need it here because the dark green is quite close to the dark brown here. We're going to have sufficient contrast that we are going to have the shade we need, but if we do a glaze over it, well, it's going to start to just get a bit too soft. So strict layering for this set of colours. Then back to the 10-0 to apply the highlights. And as a highlight for the green, I'm using that old favourite of mine, green grey. Suitable for so many different kind of greens. It's a lighter colour but not a brighter colour, and that's very important when you're selecting any of the highlights for any of the layers of paint that you're applying. Don't get too bright, just get light. Desaturated colours work best. Then it's back to a 3-0 for the webbing and any pouches. Now the colour I'm using here is the green grey once again, but instead of it being a highlight colour, it's going to be the main colour in this case. Then it's the golden maple 10-0 for highlighting. Now I'm going to be using deck tan for this. It's a very bright colour, but you need a bright colour to highlight a very light colour such as the green grey. So keep it very much under control. Don't overdo it, or you're going to end up with something that looks white rather than something that's got a sharp highlight. Now, to save the video running too long, I'm not going to show you every individual piece of equipment or clothing on the miniatures. Check the description below for areas such as boots or the webbing on the German crew figure, and you'll find the colours down there all applied in the same way as you've seen me painting so far. But one area that's always worth covering in a painting guide is the faces and the hands. Such small but very high profile areas require a degree of control, so I'm using the Golden Maple 10-0 for this. When I'm painting skin, I give a shade coat of saddle brown. It's a very reddish kind of brown, and as such it's a nice warm colour, which gives a nice warm but still contrasting shade colour for the main colour of the skin. I leave no German Camo black brown as an internal shade. It's all going to be the saddle brown. The German Camo black brown will just be framing the face or framing the hands, where it meets the sleeve of the jacket. I use a light flesh colour to then highlight, as in add another layer to the face and to the hands. Now when you're painting faces, you want to be picking out all those obvious features. I paint the nose, I paint the lips, the chin, cheekbones, and the 10-0 brush will allow you to do this. Likewise with the fingers, you can paint each finger and then paint across the back of the hands. I normally leave it here, though a second coat of the lighter flesh colour is most often required. I don't normally add a highlight, but you can do so if you want, and if you're going to do so, then a highlight once again goes on the nose, then under the eyes, so that's the top of the cheekbones, and then lips, chin, and then just on the ends of the fingers and across the back of the hands. And let's take a look at the whitewashed helmet. What I want to do here is make it look as though there is exposed metal shown through, so that's going to be on the edges that are most likely contacted through normal use, so not in the recessed areas. They're going to stay white. I'm going to use an old brush, raggedy old brush, with a little bit of German grey and just bounce it along those edges. Don't overdo it, because then it will just look like there's a grey stripe, a white stripe, a grey stripe, a white stripe. Bounce it along, make it look nice and ragged, and a little bit on the top just to finish it off. Now that we have the gun painted, we have the crew and the US para painted, we can move back to the base. So to paint the ammo base, you can see I've got the shade colour of German Camo black brown. I'm going to leave that shade around where it makes contact with the base, and there will be shade left internally around all of the woven top surface that you can see. I'm just using an old brush for this because there's no need to wear out a good quality tip painting an area such as this, especially that woven surface. That's really going to start pulling and separating the hairs and on the bristles. So I'm going to layer up through US Field Drab, Old Wood and Iraqi Sand as the highlight. Next I'm going to switch to a flat brush. That's a size 0 Golden Maple flat brush, and I'm going to start painting the large area of the base. Now I'm painting this as snow. I'm sure that's the intended theme anyway, but it's also a good example of how we can paint snow on our bases. Now you can see the flat brush here is grey even for cutting right into the cruciform mount of the gun. There might be some areas where you have to switch to a round brush, but I think you'll find this will do the vast majority of this legwork without you working on a round bristle brush which is going to get worn out across a large surface. So this is a sculpted base. It's already got the snow in place. It's even got footprints in the snow. So how do you normally do your snow, folks? In the past I have used various products that you can purchase from paint manufacturers and make a snow surface. In this case, if I was to apply that kind of product to this already completed base, well, the gun would be sunk right into it, and that's fine if that's the look that you want, but it's really going to start to get below the surface of the snow. So it is a tricky balance to achieve if you're applying your own snow product to any base that you've got. Is it deep enough? Is it too deep? I actually, after having painted this base, like the idea of a solid product such as milliput, which you then texture, painted up as snow. Of course, it's all going to come down to your own personal choice and your own personal approach. What style of snow you think looks best for your project. So if you want to create a solid surface such as this, milliput would be a great product. Green stuff, not so much. It's a lot harder to work with. Once you've got it down on the surface, you can take an old toothbrush and just lightly tap it across the top. That will then create the uneven fingerprintless surface that you're after, and you can even create those little footprints in it just using an old figure. I've got some figures that I've kept them just for footprints, you know, to dab them across any kind of material that I've used to create the surface, and it works great in this situation. You will then of course have to paint the surface, but that in itself appeals to me too, because I can get it looking exactly the way I want rather than perhaps compromising by just dealing with the product that comes out of the pot. Quite often these can look a little bit too shiny, or they can possibly look just a little bit too wet. And snow, whilst it's ice and made of water, it's not wet. So getting back to the subject, I'm just making sure I've got a nice solid coat of white across the top. It can be a little bit semi-opaque in places, and a tiny hint of that base colour coming through, because that London Grey's got a little bit of a bluish tint to it, but we're going to address that side of things in the next stage. I've given the base a glaze of ice blue, and it's just a glaze, so it's got a bluish tint across the surface. Now I've taken an old brush once again, gone back to my white, and then I'm starting to just speckle on blobs of white, and these are really ragged blobs because it's a raggedy old brush, and you can see I'm just bouncing it all over the surface, and I'm going to keep going until that blue becomes a bit of an accent to the overall colour. But it's a broken accent, and it gives a bit of a shimmer across the surface, so it's not just one solid layer of white. Then back to the ice blue again, I'm going to put a wash into the footprints around the discarded shell cases, the cruciform mount and the ammo case, and that's just going to help frame all of these little pieces against the backdrop of the white snow. So the final thing I'm going to show you in this guide is the discarded shell cases. Now, I don't like to use metallic paints when I'm painting metal objects on my layering approach, because it just clashes with the rest of the scene, with the rest of the miniature. For instance, I will use greys for ordinary metal, and in this case I'm going to use green brown as a shade colour, then Japanese uniform as the main colour of the shell with a highlight of green ochre. So we're going to end the guide there. Don't forget to check below for the link to the golden maple brushes, where you can pick up at a discount if you use the discount code that's shown. Give them a try. I think you will like them. I'm certainly going to be using them going forward. They'll be featuring in all my guides, with me showing you the size and type of brushes that I'm using. Not everybody's going to have one of these bases to paint, but it's hopefully still giving you some good ideas about the uniforms. For instance, you know, the Camo smocks and normal uniform colours, and how to apply the main coat's shading and highlights, and also maybe some ideas in your mind about how to approach snow bases. So thank you for watching, folks. Hope you enjoyed it. Thanks to all the subscribers out there, and to you folks who just drop into the channel from time to time to see what we're doing. If you'd like to support the channel and you've not already done so, hit the subscribe button, and if you all hit the bell button, that means we'll definitely see you all on the next one.